Joseph has sent his brothers back to Canaan to retrieve their father and bring him to Egypt. When Pharaoh heard the news, he was pleased, and this is a bit surprising. For the ruler of a nation to welcome an immigrant group into his kingdom was unusual, albeit it was a tiny group, only 70 people. His esteem for Joseph must have been very great. Joseph's value to the kingdom was valued by Pharaoh. He had saved Pharaoh's kingdom, made him look good and wise to the other nations, and he had made him rich. Joseph was a gift that never stopped giving. So Pharaoh turns on the spigot of blessing. He provides food and transportation to bring Jacob and his family to Egypt. Then he says that Jacob and his family will have the best of the land of Egypt. Over the centuries, the Jews have been treated horribly by the nations in which they lived, but not this time. They were treated wonderfully well, thanks to Joseph. Joseph loads them up and sends them on their way. He cautions them not to quarrel with each other. What would they have to quarrel about? I think the argument would have been over who was going to tell Jacob the truth. I am guessing the brothers blamed each other. To one, they would say, "It was you that first complained about his dreams." And to Judah, they could have said, "It was your idea to kill him." To another, "It was you that stripped him of his fine coat." To another, "It was you that threw him in the pit," etc., etc. What are you going to say to Jacob? Dad, 22 years ago, we told you a story about how Joseph had been killed and devoured by a wild animal. Actually, that was a lie. The truth is, Joseph is still alive. In fact, you know that man we told you about, the one we were all terrified of? It just so happens that that man is Joseph. According to the text, all the brothers tell Jacob is Joseph is alive and is the ruler of Egypt. It also says Jacob did not believe them, but this is predictable and believable. The sons are not exactly a trustworthy group of people. Isn't it strange? It had been easier for Jacob to believe the brothers when they said Joseph was dead than now when they say he's alive. They don't just tell him Joseph is alive. He is the prime minister of Egypt. He is one of the most powerful men in the world. I admit that this would have to be a little hard to believe. All Jacob hopes for is seeing Joseph because he is old and at life's end. However, after arriving in Egypt, he lives another 20 years. Probably the best 20 years of his life. I do not think your best years are behind you. The best is ahead of you. Blessing is in this life and then bliss of eternity with the Lord. No wonder Christians are such a positive people. Jacob and his entire family prepare to go to Egypt, but before he leaves, he offers sacrifices to the Lord. Jacob remains a worshiper of the true God. For all his faults, he has one redeeming characteristic. He fears the Lord. He honors his father and grandfather. God had given them this place, so leaving it had to be hard. Jacob had to wonder if leaving was the right decision. But then God does what God always does. He speaks to Jacob. This time he came in a vision. Jacob knew that Canaan was the promised land, promised by God to Abraham and his descendants. Now Jacob is leaving it. How then can the promise be fulfilled? It will be, but not for another 400 years. Radical things can happen in our lives that seem to run contrary to the will of God, the promises of God, and our own preferences. But God always keeps his promises. He says to Jacob, "Fear not." How many times in Scripture does God tell whoever he's speaking to, "Fear not"? Why might Jacob have been afraid? Well, there are several reasons. He's old and probably thinks that this is going to be an awfully hard journey for an old man. His sons might be drawn into the idolatry of Egypt, as well as other members of his family. I think he's fearful of his descendants falling into slavery, which indeed they did. And he doesn't want to be buried in Egypt. He wants to be buried in the land promised by God to his ancestors. Well, God promises him a lot of blessing. I will make of you a great nation. I will be with you. I will bring you back. Finally, and don't you love the biblical language, Joseph will close your eyes. In other words, you will die in Joseph's presence. Now we turn to the life of Jacob and Joseph as they settle into daily life in Egypt.